Hello, good evening. I'm thrilled to be here and to be part of this presentation of this exquisite book. Although I will say that every time I would get an email, within the title, something I forget, I kept panicking that I kept forgetting it was the title of the book, and I thought I've forgotten something. Um, It's an exquisite book. I think I first encountered one of the poems from it in the New Yorker, Water Like a Stone, and just remembered being completely knocked out by this poem, which of course the title is taken from this wonderful hymn and poem. And it was just so beautifully woven with very slight rhymes and rhythms and so forth, and just maybe not the kind of poem I'm used to seeing in the New Yorker a lot of the time. I've known Angela for some years now, and it's always wonderful to be in conversation, I feel, in person, but also in various poetic ways. She is the daughter of a composer, a British composer, and her mother originally, I think, hails from Naples. Is that right? And so I think one of the things that Angela brings is, she is born in Yorkshire. So I think there's this maybe kind of northern sense of language. And then maybe on the other hand, this extreme southern sense of language where we have fluency in Italian and quotation, and maybe even a particular flavor of Italian. And yet she resides in Cambridge, which you think of as maybe the center of a certain kind of literary gravitas. But I think that she brings all of this together is something I very much appreciate. And this notion of living a life in translation between languages and between places is something that very much appeals to me, and I think something that I sympathize with. I'm using that sense of sympathize the way maybe strings sympathize. There are several registers of language that I see in Leighton's work. Among them, I think kind of wonderful words out of maybe kind of this Northern English. I had to look a lot of words up in this book, and I really enjoyed looking them up. Clarty, keckling, Staiths, Purfley, Fipple. Fipple, it turns out, is exactly the perfect word in the poem it is in. And while I have seen a musical recorder any number of times, I never knew that particular word. And while I have myself played the violin in a millennium past, I did not know the word purfling, which again is exactly right. I think Angela has also rescued some words for me that I had about given up on. One of them is Instagram, and we'll hear that in the wonderful Murmurations poem, I think that Angela's going to read later. Of course, I think of Instagram as this app, the way Amazon has taken the wonderful word Kindle and various words get ruined. But Instagram, I guess, invented for the app, becomes in Angela's hands an actual Instagram, an instant letter that forms and unforms in the sky. So I think she's taken what might be quite a banal word and made it magical. Certainly, we hear a lot of sounds. I think it makes sense coming from a musician and from the daughter of a composer. I think in a conversation at one point, and you can correct me, there was a sense in the household that one had to be very quiet, maybe even silent, while the father's compositions are coming about. And I think out of that, Angela just has an exquisite ear for listening to the quiet sounds, maybe on a cold winter's day, but the sounds of language, how they sympathize with each other like sounds on a string, and the wonderful cluster of consonants in something like keckling and so forth. So I think, and Angela can correct me later, that there might be something in this childhood of music, but also silence and listening, that is particularly good to tune the ear of the poet. And we do have things like a rain fugue and a rain scherzo. There's wonderful doublings in this poem, in this book of poems. The first poem is about snowdrops. The last poem is about cyclamen. And yet they are both winter solstice or early spring flowers. And there's this feeling perhaps of going through the year where we end and begin on certain kinds of flowers that indicate where we are at the beginning of the year. I love that a shoe that sort of appears all by itself in a fresco in Pompeii, in the next poem ends up being a shoe by the side of the road, and how the poems are also very attuned and sympathetic with each other and listening to each other. So it's not just the individual poems, although there's such a richness, not only of the terroir of diction, wonderful different forms that are visual on the page, that are stanzaic, that have unusual divisions. And there are also all of these sounds speaking to each other. So for me, I think I'm not always interested in the structure of a book of poems. I'll have to be honest, sometimes I really just flip through books. But this is one where the form of the book seems to be an amplification of the more miniature forms of the poems themselves. And I feel a sense of kind of going through a year of beginning and ending in the cold of winter, but also maybe summers by the sea, and this kind of oscillation, keeping with the sound metaphor, from England to Italy. One of my favorite poems, I don't think it's one that Angela's going to read, is about Andrew Marvell and complaining by the river Humber. I might not even be pronouncing that right. To me, as an American, Humber is as exotic as the Ganges. I've never been to it. And to me, it was just a literary river. And to find out that, his father had drowned in this river, and that when he's complaining, there's an actual tragic loss. And then it's such a beautiful evocation of the physicality and the place of this river. So I feel that she's a poet of sound and of place and of vibrations and between places and between sounds. And I'm just really thrilled to have my own copy, and I hope you will all get a copy as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alicia. And I'm absolutely thrilled that you were prepared to take part in this event. I will come back to some of the things you've said later. And thanks to all of you, friends, fellow poets, colleagues who've joined us. I hope that in spite of this kind of rather strange boxed-in distance, we can also have a kind of conversation later. Well, I want to start with two stanzas actually from one of Alicia's own poems, since I've loved her work since I first read it. They're stanzas that speak so memorably of something that I think interests us both. I'm afraid there's no text to these. The text will come later. So from Cyprian Variations by A.E. Stallings. The heart is a divided city between two alphabets. Church bells, minarets betoken time has stopped where it is broken. Nothing forgets. This is called history, not pity. It is not spoken. To remember is to cross through no man's land into an imaginary country you do not recognize. But where the streets are real, the walls are stone, you gaze through other eyes. Forgetting, remembering, this or the other country, crossing, imagining, all packed so beautifully into those few lines with their featherlight rhymes. I wish I could spend more time reading and talking about Alicia's poetry, but I better do my duty here. So to something I forget. When my brother went to order a copy in his local bookshop, he couldn't understand why the assistant went on drumming her fingers on the desk in irritation. Well, can you remember the author's name? She eventually barked. It's the same problem that you had, Alicia, naming the title. Not easy to dictate. So remembering, forgetting, and between them a comma. I suppose by that comma I wanted to suggest something of the pause, when poets work to forget what they remember or remember to forget, and so cross into that imaginary country. And perhaps because I've spent so much of my life writing critical prose, the wasteful pauses needed by poetry are particularly scary. I'll read one poem to start, again without the text on screen, because it contains ideas that will pop up later about rhythm, distant rhyme, memory, elegy. It's called From Poetry's Lighthouse Again. I hope you don't mind my reading from the book, but I've got such a small screen that I thought I'd never be able to see it clearly enough, and I'd never be able to make it bigger. From Poetry's Lighthouse Again. Lonely inside, here's one last stand in the art of stopping. An edge, a lookout. It might be a lifelong practice for the end. So pause, rock fast. Friend, are you here, where a Fresnel lens is turning its head? Send news, send word, maybe lend an ear. Sea airs, a seasoning, too salt for green. Yet sea blight, purslin, grasswort survive the waves' rockabye, the storms careen. We've been here, remember? Each high white tower, an edgy groundling, set to deliver illuminations by rote, by the hour, by pause and beat. Oh, distractions clarify, by swipe and repeat. Self's frail composite attends what must come. Each pulse is I. On sand, waves scribble their memoir for the day. The tide's massif in motion replies, erase, erase. Then you went away. This signal station searchlights the sky, gives ear to otherwise. Who's to say the night's too dark? My dear, goodbye. From now on, thanks to Jasmine's wizardry, the text will be visible. I'll now read a poem that crosses times and places, remembering plagues and pandemics of the past as it looks across those desolate Venetian islands. But it's also a poem about glass, that other Venetian industry, the magic and the fragility of glass. It's sand heated to liquid and then blown into shapes on a breath of air. It's just magic to watch. The poem's called, just to change a biblical phrase a little, In a Glass Lightly. My dear, I think neither rule nor spell can wish them back, the nameless, the lost. Here I walk in the city of water and learn the art of pausing, to know how carnival in a mask comes home with ashen beak and goggle, and goggle eyes, old crow in a domino, summoning those who must play their part in the Bone Pits casino. For here are places, forgotten cremations, plague, smallpox, cholera, COVID, where high brick walls still hide what's below, though water seeps and salt winds corrode, and tides rearrange a necklace of weeds on dead-end steps given to reflection, and abandoned islands quarantine their dead, where wild flowers mark what no one remembers. Yet here's liquefaction of sand and silica, the clotted miracle of a red-hot spit fired in the heart lock, tipped for quick work, turning its molten ball to a bauble that lives by a thread of breath inspired. A thing so shatteringly fine it cries aloud in its skin, makes light of nothing, and shapes a solid as clear as day. A snake, a stallion, cut glass ephemerides, a moth so fragile, so invisibly visible it's as if you milked the sky to make a spirit come by, breathed on, souffle. Now see, it's one like a crystal soul from grit and flame, like the ghost of a smile. Consider, don't touch, in a glass lightly, creation's toy unbroken for a while. The next poem is also a sea poem, and to me it's quite a strange one that seemed to write itself rather than it. I don't know if many of you have had this experience. When it happens, it can be a blessing, or else it can be a terrible mistake. This poem recalls a long ago boat trip, the full moon's kind of leggy whiteness on the black water. But like all memories, it throws up other flotsam dreams, imaginings, a bit like how weather comes over the sea and travels for miles to leave its little signs on the shore. To remember is to cross, as Alicia put it. This poem is called Elegy, Long Crossings. Full moon's in love with water and leaves a sign, this crazing face spilt on a moving base, like a spectral reminiscence slipped out of mind. Such lunacy to love black water so, to fall for it, then stay and ride the waves like a paper doily floated, or a lotus flower. Black mirror, stressed and whirled, obsidian sea, on which the moon's Medusa, flailing, seems a plasm of light that makes nowhere more clear. White heart of darkness, pulsing, holding fast against the rush and passing, phantom token stayed, like something breaking, never broken. So dream might net oblivion's deeps and find someone I forget, friend of a short night fled, fellow of almost never, long lost to me. So memory's darkening book retains no face. What's this, then, pooled in the waves' amnesiac tug? Apparencies of moonshine, paramours, one luminous dogged light riding beside as we buck small waves and leave a wake behind. Here's something known at removes, yet close as touch, like love for one who left without a name and went far out, now suddenly found late surfacing with all life's faces drowned. Small graves attend this walking on the sand. Low shallows take what comes and must go on. So crumbling landfill fills the print I leave, swallows the space shoes dent, lead weights my feet. You feel it, how your spring is sucked back in. Quick steps are how you keep from slip and drowning, tucking each shoe in grainy spills to lift as grit compresses, and all your bone weight goes forward again, free from that burying stay, heel and toe caressing sand's underlay. So weathers laid like letters, S's, F's, a ripple rhythm scored on shore, as if the graphics of a storm, imprints of wind, had signed their wavelengths lengthwise on the sand. I might be tracing megatons of fall in these light scriptures waving out of line, or tracking drifts from miles or months ago that scribble memorabilia where they land, like travellers making notes, or poets knowing the lag of what's forgotten is Philip forgoing. I seem to be drawn to rhyme in this volume. I've not really used rhyme very much in the past, and it's mostly internal or half rhyme. Maybe because once I decided that this was a volume about memory and unmemory, rhyme is a kind of alternative ear memory. As you're reading, you remember a sound, which then a little bit distracts from the sense and sets up its own counter sense. And I think that happens in both writing and reading, as if the brain's paying attention to different aspects of words. Here's another Lighthouse poem. It's a sonnet. It's written in memory of my old friend, the poet Anne Stevenson. And I was staying in Sicily by the sea when I first heard that she was, in her own words, slipping away. Now that place always sends me news of her. From the Lighthouse. Far-seeing stroke, oblivious blessing. Its smudged gold rifts a slow thumb roll over the sea's darkening skin. It might be death's old news, recalled across the night's irresolvable distances, bringing you round and round on earth. Aerialed here, where this beam of light repeats its measure, shines, yet keeps brushing aside, 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 the dark's starlit, moth-eaten curtain, the cursive restlessness of waves that hide the enigma of what lies deeper, while news love meant to keep forever is wiped so lightly by this scanning weeper. You've heard from Alicia that Italy is my other country, and indeed Naples is my other home, as my mother was Neapolitan. Indeed, the heart is a divided city. But perhaps it's those divisions that also spur us into verse. You always feel like a foreigner who has crossed into the language from afar, adopting a strange tongue, whichever way the strangeness goes, if you see what I mean, whichever language you're in. And I know a number of people, a number of poets here also have this kind of dual heritage, or an adopted language. I don't know if you've ever seen a murmuration of starlings. It's like watching huge billowing nets flowing in and out, a bit like spirographs. Murmuration, according to the dictionary, and I do keep a dictionary by me most of the time, its origin is obscure, but it's a lovely word that sets up a sound in the moving shape of the thing. Unfortunately, we can't make poems move on the page, but I suppose one tries to make sounds move through them. So, murmurations. I tried to copy the sort of look of them on the page, but when I look at it now, I think it was actually too regular. It should have been more moving and more varied. Dusk draws them in to net or sieve, the lights paling at close of day, wing tip to tip, a fluvial knit of starlings gather, feathering together in thousands, tens of thousands, a spill of shapes that mimic a giant brain thinking. Una passeggiata, paesaggio, saggio, no destination, just the ins and outs of blank air tethered by a fretwork of nerves, a willing, perfect intricacy of wills. Who knows why it is, knotting the last light in ropes of flight, then inverting, dispersing, as if a script were writing in their wings, à la piste pointilliste, through spaces of sky. So I pause to see how near, how far, ponte sisto, siste, viator. Stay, traveller. Another flock starts to lock and loosen, an Instagram of moving parts, like, very like a net, a trawl, a cloud, a camel. What makes this shape? Which bird decides to switch back, split, reconstellate, then dive out of sight and crosshatch into a charcoal storm cloud? Birds of a feather, no one knows why, gone tomorrow, their shadow crosses this bridge where we linger to remember auguries of flight and read a sound in the murmur of a shape. How are we doing for time? I think I've skipped a poem, haven't I? I've got a thing up on my computer saying Zoom, join a meeting, sign in. Should I be doing this? No, I'll just continue. I'm going to go back, Jasmine, to a previous poem about feet. I don't know why it is that I'm so often drawn to writing about feet, those funny objects that are mostly beneath notice. I think this might be a bit relevant, but the Cinderella fairy tale in fact began in Naples, and there's a fresco, as Lucy was saying, in Pompeii showing a single shoe that seems to belong to no one, that just points out of the picture. And funnily enough, also in Naples, a single shoe was found in the coffin of the poet Leopardi when it was opened long after his death. So there's something about single shoes that speaks to me. And here's a poem which, though not set in Naples, is called Another Lost Shoe. So who, forgetting, just hopped away, or dropped it, maybe, from bike or backpack on a winter fenland path that rides the nearly imaginable curve of the earth? Larger than life, from a distance maybe the bloom of a flower, litter more like, but it's only a whitish trainer thrown by the by, off course, shiny in microfiber. Someone should bin it, tidy the land that's green and level for miles around. But no, its lostness stands to attention, a step, but no sound, an open question. What size? Whose fit? Something rootless haunts about its shape, its look of missing, pointless yet pivotal, ordinary, surprised. A spoor of laces tangles on the ground. It might be a sign, a thing never finished, only abandoned, like half a rhyme. It stays faithful to being forgotten, points the way like a lostness found. Days later, no change. It's hollow, too human, exposed to the sky, mouthing its secret like no one's business, voice crying for a cry. Here's hoping, it dreams, hoping, a small ask. And I'm going to end with two last poems, if I may. If this is the time, is that all right? There's a section of the book called Riddling Hell about war, and it was the hardest to write. We're so used to the personal confessional register in poetry, and we've lost so many shared myths and faiths. It's often not easy to find a public voice of grief or protest. So maybe all one can do is kind of set one against another. This poem has got a slightly mad logic of puns and etymologies. It's spaced out, part bracketed to suggest voices debating. But it ends with a quote you'll recognise from Isaac Rosenberg. I'm not sure if it works, but I thought I should make myself try reading it. It's called Returns. Returns, Invasion of Ukraine, February 2022. A February sun amazes the earth space. It has happened before. Were we looking away? Spring comes round on Earth's rotary base. I recall toy soldiers in uniform, in rows, Today's my birthday, many happy returns. Elsewhere there's shot, mortar shells, grenades. A brimstone butterfly lands, a surprise. Are they only larking, those boys, in the skies? And now a tortoiseshell, copper and black. A building, shelled, spills a rainbow of lives. How count many happy returns? How sing? The wheeze of a bomb starts a count to nothing. Listen, there are larks zoning overhead. Granadas of pomegranate likely to bleed. From granatus, Latin, which is full of seed. Persephone's hunger led to 6 months in hell. I watch green shoots inch out of the ground. Crowds in the underground hear sirens and pray. What life can spring from seeds of a grenade? It has happened before. We were looking away. Happy's a cheer word, more luck than happening. Words are loaded, though they might refrain. How many returns, returns, returns? Returning, we hear the larks, and then a plane. And very quickly, a last poem, a wintry love poem. To forget what you came for and find something else instead seems like the essence of writing poetry. There's always that element of luck, obstacle, surprise, diversion. Though, of course, I may only be cheering myself up about that forgetfulness that comes, of course, with aging. So the last poem is Cyclamen at the Winter Solstice. Something I forget, something the brain hunts back stairs for in cobwebby haunts, a neural cubbyhole that has shut its door. I'm off guard, distracted by this arabesque of fans, a pinwheel turnaround. Which flip sides right? Flunky to the cold moon, pearl on the ground, yet winging it very still, flung from a whirlwind into this world, thin wrapper, litter, love letter, sugar spun, a whiteness unfurled. Yet something I forget, standing waylaid by this light-flared dancer, icy marker of a dark path growing longer and harder, by a grace so utterly careless, other, so obliviously keen that I stand accused of being here, still needing to explain. Dear winter survivor, how many now dying, I might live to know forgetting's a life gift. I came for something. Is it time to go? Thank you.
That was a wonderful reading, and I'm really glad that you read those poems. You mentioned, a bit as you were going into the reading about the scholarly side of you, and you've written about Shelley and Rossetti and Victorian women writers, Walter de la Mare, who I think is you have this wonderful anthology of poems responding to him. These are poets, I think, that are considered nowadays slightly old-fashioned or out of sync with more modern experiments, but perhaps also coming back. I mean, I think part of the freshness of this book is its exploration of sound and these rhymes and half rhymes and alliterations and internal rhymes. That sense that what I would call the school of sincerity, which dominates modern poetry and thinks of half rhymes and alliteration as ornaments rather than as vehicles of meaning. I kind of wondered how the scholarship of these perhaps unfashionable poets and your own fashioning of poems are related in your work.
Oh, gosh, yes. Well, I began with Shelley, and of course, Shelley is a great poet of sound. Um, and probably that was why I chose him all those years ago. Walter de la Mare is perhaps different, and that was a bit more of a sort of crusading volume to try and bring him back to into attention. Because I think it's true in the States, but it's also true here that there's a younger generation that have never read him. And my generation was sort of brought up on him practically. You know, he was in every children's anthology of poetry. And I think it's a pity. Of course, it always happens that people go in and out of fashion. So that book was an attempt to bring him to a modern audience. And I should say that there's a lovely poem by Alicia in that book. I I miss sound in some contemporary poetry. The poets I most like are those who are in some ways allowing the noise that words make to not exactly dictate what they say, but to offer an alternative saying, an alternative way of saying. And I know when I first pick up a volume of new poetry, I'm not thinking, what is this about? I'm thinking, what does this sound like? So I just open and try it. And if if the language kind of grabs me in some way, I mean, writing poetry is such a funny business, and I came to it quite late in life. So in a way, my critical writing belongs to a previous part of my life. But I always think, I don't know what you think here, that when you try to write something, you don't go into it, into the blank page thinking, I want to write a poem about this or the other. Or you may do that, but then the poem doesn't want to write about what you thought you wanted to write about. And that's something to do with how the words start to side together, how they start to make noises that were not part of your intention, but just start to work. And so you're often taken, I suppose that's what I've been getting at in that last poem, you often, you think you're going down the path to put the bins out, but in fact you get waylaid by something else. So yes, and to answer your question, yes, I think my critical work probably does at some level feed into the poetry, although I tried to keep them very separate for a long time. But also, yes, I wish we could bring back a bit more of that sounding effect. Probably my favourite poet is Hopkins, who can do it so wonderfully, so you feel that the words are just taking over from the eye.
You have a wonderful poem in here called Ditty for the Poets, which ditty suggests it's a quite sort of slight little song-like thing, but it seems to me there's something quite essential in it. And Hopkins is the first poet you quote, and you're listing nonce words or hapax words from these poets, and yet from the one word you can almost extrapolate the entire aesthetic of the poet. And I think that's wonderful, where Muldoon's word is quoof, and Clare has soodle, and Hopkins has hornlight. And you end, where sense cuts a caper with noise and a nonce word resounds ever after. I think one of the things, you often hear, and poets will say, whether it's Frost or whatever, that poetry should come out of how language is spoken. But I'm kind of concerned that the spoken language is becoming flatter and flatter and flatter. Now we're going to have, artificial intelligence sort of influencing, I think, how people speak. And it's generally a flattening. To me, I think it's a little bit connected with this idea of losing the biodiversity of the natural world, and that every time we lose a word, we're losing some kind of way of thinking or some kind of regional viewpoint, which is what I'm really attracted to, these registers of words that you have in here, because they're always perfect for what you're describing. I didn't even know the concept of sea fret, which I take to be a sea fog, but
Mm.
you use fret in many ways, whether it's, fretting as maybe worrying, but you also have the frets of a fretted stringed instrument. And it seems to me that rather than maybe being a stay against confusion, it's a kind of stay against flattening. And that in itself becomes a kind of maybe bad kind of forgetfulness, this kind of losing the specificity of language often attached to the natural world. And I'm very intrigued by what your sense of, do you have this kind of magpie sense of, oh, that's a very nice word, I'm going to hold on to it, or all these words just always in the back of your head, and you're like, this rhymes with this, and it's kind of grabbing me.
No, I love reading dictionaries, and I don't know if you know Robert Macfarlane's book Landmarks, which does exactly that. It rescues a lot of forgotten words to do with the natural world. And I read that avidly. I mean, often the words are a bit too far-fetched to be able to use in a poem, but sometimes if they've just got um, enough kind of sound meaning, they can work without putting people off. I know one of the problems in teaching poetry, as I've done for many years, is that students worry I'm not going to understand it, and getting over their problem of I've got to be able to understand it before I can do anything with it, and saying there are many ways of understanding. Understand with the ear, understand even with your eyesight. What does the poem look like? You don't actually have to understand the meaning of every word. And you can enjoy words without meaning, as we all did with nursery rhymes. And so, yeah, I'm kind of agreeing with you here that it's partly, I think, not entirely, but partly the poet's job to increase the vocabulary, so that we can also increase what we think and what we feel and who we are.
And that wonderful use of the Instagram and murmuration again. I mean, because it's next to some interesting words, and you have the Italian also kind of performing a murmuration with the letters where they're changing before your eyes. I think murmuration would make a fantastic animation. Someone should animate it where you could watch the letters kind of moving around the page. And I'm not always into multimedia poetry, but I don't think that would take away from the wonderful poem that it is on the page, but it kind of begs to be animated. Have you had many poems made into multimedia things, put to music, for instance? I wonder how you feel about poems put to music. And
I'm fine with it. I mean, I think it's a different medium, but I have had a few set to music, set to piano and voice, and I kind of love listening to them. It's a different experience, and of course, like all out loud arts, arts that are spoken or sung out loud, it tends to fix the sound, which is lovely. But what I also like about the poem on the page is that it's silent, and you go back to silence again, and therefore each reader unfixes the sound for themselves, so it's kind of more open. Yeah, I've forgotten the first bit of your question now. Yeah, wouldn't it be lovely to be able to have poetry books that somehow had movable type? So you could sort of shape them up a bit or make them move in a pattern.
a snow globe of a poem.
Yes.
Yeah, I think also, when I go to schools or whatever and talk about poetry, because
Mm.
I really want to stave off this anxiety of I don't know what this word means, which in fact younger people don't have when they're looking at apps. I mean, Paul Muldoon's Quoof would be a perfect name for an app, Quoof.
Yes.
Instagram.
Yes.
I often start with Jabberwocky because and the kids love it, of course, and I can recite it. And but then I'll just say, uh, does chortle sound like a happy word or a sad word? What, like, just is this sound like a hot word or a cold word? What? And they're very quick to sort of decide what the words kind of mean, even though obviously, they might not actually correspond directly to a meaning. So I quite like nonsense versus way of that, which where the sound um, is partly to destabilize your idea of what it means. And yet at the same time, a lot of these poems, a lot of nonsense poems, have a very strong emotional sense, often wistfully melancholy or sometimes vaguely dangerous, or and I like the facts that it kind of destabilizes society. Of this word has to mean a particular thing. It can, mean by the sound.
Yeah. Yeah. And the lovely thing about English, of course, is how many puns we actually have in the language. So we've already got that sort of openness of
We
meaning.
we have some questions from the audience, which we should get to. Michael Schmidt asks or says, the public voice Angela was talking about, doesn't it require a defined I, which sets the poet up as a kind of orator? The voice has to define itself in a kind of personal personification, different in kind from the lyric I.
Gosh, yes. The whole business of the I in the poem, that I, does bother me a little. Um, I think I think if you have a kind of mythology or a backdrop of some kind in a poem, you can get away from that element of preachiness that I think Michael is getting at there. That to write in a public voice, you've got to basically have a political platform and be saying something to the general public. But if you can draw on whatever mythology it is, but the problem with mythologies now is that we don't share them so easily. So, using a Christian language, which I've sometimes done, or a classical language, which I know you've done, can be off-putting. But it can at least get away from this is a poem about me and this is what I think, which I kind of don't want my poems to be. Do you agree?
I
Can you answer
I
Michael's
think we
question?
have a second question that might be kind of related to this from Beverly Bragg. That she says she admired all of these poems, but was particularly struck by your Ukraine poem, and you said it was the most difficult to write. She says it was impressive, and wonder if you could talk about the process. I mean, I think one of the things talking about, you know, not trying to speak from some kind of public thing is what you had with just the wonderful juxtaposition that seemed to be working very well. But maybe you can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. Um, I suppose by kind of using the puns and the etymologies, I was trying to let an idea run through the poem which didn't belong to anybody. I mean, there's somebody in the poem saying this has happened before. There's somebody else in the poem saying it's my birthday and I want some happy returns. But none of them are very fixed. But I think perhaps, I mean, I don't do it very much, and I'm wondering if this is a way forward to sort of think about the visual shape of a poem more. So just using brackets is always fascinating because who exactly is speaking in a bracketed phrase? Um, and so yes, I'm sort of casting
This is maybe even related to the brackets. Jane Simmons asks, She would be interested to know what draws you to particular stanzaic forms, what possibilities they open up, or what limitations they impose. That seems to be somewhat related to how a poem looks on the page to a certain extent, as well as the sound.
Yeah. I suppose the first thing I'd say is that I don't predetermine on the form. I find that it kind of happens like that poem to Anne Stevenson, the Elegy. It was only when I finished writing it that I realised it was 14 lines. So it's as if sometimes one thinks in, I don't know, 14-line paragraph, as it were, or you think in stanzaic passages because you have to breathe, and you need to pause sometimes and rethink or recalibrate. I try to be as varied as possible in the stanza forms that emerge from how I write. But as I say, it's always a bit of a unknown quantity until the poem is finished. Sometimes I get it quite wrong, and I don't know if other people feel this as well. I think, this is going to be in terza rima, and I get to the end and I feel really pleased with myself, and the poem is dreadful. And then I realise it needs unpicking and spacing out and being a kind of spacey poem without that strong rhyme form. So I don't decide in advance, and I just kind of, it's an element of just holding your breath and hoping that the thing will shape in such a way that it makes some kind of sense.
It's some of the stanzas in this are your own invention. Are they all coming from something else? I'm quite attracted to the ones that start off with a short line, because that's often an end of the stanza move, and it's very nice to see that at the beginning of a stanza.
Yep. Like I think the shoe poem. Yes. What I often find that I write one or two stanzas once you've got past just the scribbling, brainstorming stage. Write a few stanzas, and the shape is already emerging, and then I just try to follow it in the later stanzas. So I don't specifically try to copy previous poets, but sometimes I possibly do unconsciously. And I quite like a variety of line lengths. And if you can't get the variety of line lengths, to have a lot of caesuras, which break up the line length when you're reading it. But these poems are perhaps more stanzaic than some of my previous volumes. I don't quite know why. Must be the direction that I'm going in at the moment. But you're very stanzaic, and you write wonderful. Well, I know your terza rima translation of Dante. So do you decide in advance, or does it?
What you're describing sounds very similar. I mean, a stanza will often be kind of, I try something out and then I just see, can I replicate that? And I do find that stanzas are good for thinking in, that they're quite generative, and they can kind of pull you through connections and thoughts. I think you've addressed a bit of Rachel Spence's question, which is your approach to form in your poetry. Royston Tester would like to know more about your relationship with a dictionary.
I think
Something between a deep, intoxicating well and divorce. Seems rather extreme. I guess there is a title, Sleeping with the Dictionary. I can't put my brain on that right now, but
it's Elizabeth Bishop who said,
yes,
"He's your best friend."
yes.
When she took her poetry classes. And there are times when you want to kick it away too, because when I'm stuck, I just love to leaf through a dictionary. I particularly like Chambers' dictionary, and this may be related to something that you mentioned right at the beginning, because it's based in Scotland, and it has a lot of Scottish words, which I then remember from my childhood, a lot of Northern English words. But I think that just reading a dictionary, just opening at a page and reading it, just takes you into language. and away from whatever problems you've got or whatever you're feeling miserable about or happy about. So it's a bit of a self-distancing technique as well, perhaps.
Um, and I think Jazz will have to tell us when we go over, but you have a couple more questions here, which are also very interesting. Lisa Kelly asks about, there says there's a feeling of improvisation at heart, I think, which is a wonderful observation that, despite these, what might seem like very elaborate forms, there's a sense of maybe thought on the wing. Do you look to, I'm wondering how you instill this practice, and do you look to other art forms? Lisa asks.
Well, certainly music as the other art form, music more than painting. I mean, it's in a way it's a lovely compliment, because if you think, and I'm sure all of us do that, the amount of wasted time you spend fiddling with a line or trying to get a word, and then suddenly something just comes. It often comes from way outside, and it's like a form of luck. So if you can catch that feeling of improvisation to disguise the amount of boring, silly work that you do on the page, scribbling things out and writing them on top and then again, that's great. I think that's when a poem works.
That sounds very much, what a jazz musician would say. There's all of this work going into the scales and so forth, so that you can sound
Yeah,
spontaneous.
that's right. Yeah. Was there one other question? And
There is one last question, which is about Anne Stevenson and her, any advice you remember her giving you? But I think jazz is also, I think this would be the last question.
Anne was lovely. She was my best, great friend, and poem reader. She gave very hard criticisms, and in a way that was what I what I cherished her for. We used to send each other poems, and she would completely kind of demolish a poem I'd written. So I think she helped me to toughen up a bit. I have to say she wasn't always a good reader. I sometimes think she got things wrong, as indeed I sometimes got things wrong in her work. But she had a very good ear, and she was a musician too, of course, in her youth. So I think she was always listening for false notes and found lots of them. Anne did not like words she couldn't understand, however. And that was sometimes a battle. There was sometimes a battle between us about that, because she wanted to know what a poem meant more than I thought was necessary. There's a whole other story there, but I did deposit Anne's letters to me in the university library in Cambridge, if ever anyone wants to go and look at them. Thank you, Alicia, in particular. That was so interesting. I wish we could go on talking,
That would be great.
but we will.
Next time.
And thank you to everyone at Carcanet as well, who's made this possible and continues to publish volumes in spite of the publishing climate.
Thank you guys so much. It's been a real pleasure. I'm so sorry to cut the conversation short, especially when, it's really getting going there. Thank you guys for all your questions. It was just brilliant to have you involved. And congratulations, of course, Angela. I know this launch has come a bit later than publication, so I'm really glad that we finally got to do this.
Running away from doing it.
For you guys, I've put the link in the chat for you, and there's a discount code so you can get your £2 off a copy of the book. Please do go and buy a copy of the book and use that code on our website. I'm also putting in the chat the details for our next launch, which is a week today. We're going to launch Rachel Mann's second collection, which is called Eleanor Among the Saints, which is really exciting. You can sign up there. She's going to be talking to Kim Moore about that. So I'm going to leave the chat open for like a couple of minutes, and you can get your last minute messages in there. But really, I think that's everything from us. So thank you guys again, and well done.